Today in Roach Reflections I want to talk about the moving feeder for roach. I've done a feature fishing the lower Stour about a year ago when I caught a couple of very good bream and one or two roach on the moving feeder. This method has been around a long time, but in the guise of the rolling ledger. And Oxford angler Peter Stone wrote about this method fishing on the Thames with a rolling ledger for roach way back in the I think it's very early 60s, but I'm sure he was using it in the 1940s and 50s. It's an old method, and it's one that really works incredibly well on the Thames around Oxford, where you've got that steady flow, and you need a winter flow, really, an autumn or a winter flow with a bit of colour and a good steady flow, and you need a clean bottom, to use a phrase. What you don't need is lots of bits of weed and muck on the bottom. I've fished this method on the Thames around about 10 years ago. I had the time to be able to go up to the Thames. I've got the time now, but it's a long journey to make, and I prefer to stick much more locally most of the time. The development on the method is basically to, instead of just using swan shot link ledgers, which is what Peter Stone did, he was able to adjust how much weight he had on his link, which is just a piece of line coming off the main line, so that he could get this ledger to stop, hold, move, and so on, and work through the swim. And like I say, he used bread paste on, say, a size 12 or a size 10. He was well known for using very soft bread paste. But the modern variant that Andy Nellist, who originally was living at Tring and since moved to more of the Oxford area, but he told me about this method a decade ago, and I tried it out, was to use tiny little cage feeders. And these feeders, you can buy a cage feeder down to about 12 grams, which is about a little bit under half an ounce. But by getting hold of some mesh, and you can buy a bird feeder for £3 or £4, or probably cheaper if you go to the sort of pound shops and things, and take that roll of mesh and chop it up and bend it around a cylindrical piece of metal, like a bank stick or something, and then with a bit of lead strip from roofing lead and some power gum loops. And you need that loop because you're going to attach it to the line with a link swivel. You've now got a tiny little feeder. They can take anything from a couple of grams up to sort of about 10 grams. And as you change swims, and the whole thing idea is to rove swims, it's quite a good idea to move downstream. So as you move from swim to swim, you send a trail of bait down the river, and that may trigger feeding for roach before you actually get to that swim, so it may move from the swim above. So you need to make some feeders. As far as the rest of the tackle is concerned, it's fairly straightforward. I use either an 11-foot or a 12-foot carbon feeder rod with carbon tips. According to the flow, you need to select the best tip. A carbon tip is quite good, quite springy. The bites are often drop backs because you cast out, feed a big bow into the line, very big bow, and then you'll see the tip sort of nodding away, and often the bites, it just springs back suddenly or gives a bump, and quite often the tip carries on bouncing around because the fish have self-hooked. So the first bit is to make some feeders. You need a feeder rod, a fairly small fixed-spool reel. I used Stradic 2500s or even some 1000s, loaded with 5 or 6 pound line. You need a fairly thick line, fairly strong line. You're going to hook snags now and again. The fact that this feeder's moving, it's going to run into snags at times. You're going to have to pull for a break, and it's best to sacrifice the hook link and the hook rather than lose the feeder. You will lose feeders sometimes, the whole thing gets jammed up. The rig's very simple. On the end of the when you thread up the line, thread on a link swivel. This is important because you want to be able to change feeders. You want to try different ones, different weights according to the swim. Sometimes you'll find the feeders too heavy and it's just holding. Other times it's too light and it just won't even bump and hold. It just whizzes through the swim. So that's no good. So thread up the link swivel. Then I thread on a buffer bead, one of these rubber beads that will push over a swivel, and then I tie on an ordinary small swivel, and then the buffer bead goes over the eye of the swivel, and the link swivel that's going to have the feeder is going to be against the buffer bead. Then to keep the hook length away from the feeder, I tie in, take about a foot of 8-pound. I've got some, it's actually nylon trace line for trout fishing. I think it's about 8-pound line, and I just knot a length of that with a grinner knot onto the other end of the swivel, and then make a double overhand loop about 6 inches from that swivel. So the feeder, this fairly stiff line, keeps the feeder away from the hook link. And then I have about a 2-foot hook link of fairly strong line, 0.14 or 0.16 is probably best. Fairly strong, because you're going to put on a size 10 hook. Don't put a 14, don't put a 12. You're going to be fishing breadflake on this, or a big bread punch. And believe it or not, a size 10 will catch your roach down to ½ an ounce. You don't want ½ ounce roach, you want the ones over a pound really. So the hook's a big one, and the hooks I prefer are the Kamasan B611s or B611s. These are absolutely perfect. The 611 slightly stronger. This method, although you're fishing for roach on the Thames, you'll pick up bream, big chub, quite a big silver bream sometimes if you get lucky. And I know Andy has had barbel on this method as well, including maybe 1 or 2 doubles. So you never quite know. On a mild day in the winter with a good flow, all sorts of fish will turn up apart from the roach. I've fished it on the Stour, and I've had, as I say, good bream and some quite nice roach. I don't think it's quite as deadly on the Stour as the Thames, but it does work. The problem on the Stour is there's just so much muck on the bed of the river, quite often makes it hard going, but it does work. So having rigged up this very simple rig, you're ready to fish. You're going to, for a full day, you're going to need a couple of loaves put through a blender, keeping back 8 or 10 slices for bait. Keep them in a plastic bag, those slices, keep them dry. Maybe only take out half a slice at a time. A big bread punch is ideal. You want something like 12 or even 14 millimeters. Probably one of the big meat punches might be the easiest way to get one that big, or a pinch of flake. And it's pretty simple. You just select a swim. You need to be sat nice and comfortable, facing downstream with a rod rest, a big extended rod rest with the rod held pretty high. And then you cast out, you read the river, look at where the flow is. And when you look at the Thames in the winter, you think, God, the roach aren't going to be out in that main flow. That's where they are. They're out in the main flow. They're not in the slacks. They're holding out in that flow. And by creating this trickle of breadcrumb down the river, they will feed. And like I say, it's not a hard method to use. You've got to accept that sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes I travelled all the way up to Oxford, sometimes around 9-10 years ago, 200-mile round trip, and once or twice I blanked, once or twice I hooked a fish and lost it. But other days I had up to 50 roach, plus some silver bream with roach over a pound, silver bream over a pound, the odd bream. I think the best bream I had was about £4. Occasionally I caught a pike, which seems odd. I think because the pike is sat still on the bottom, the line goes across the pike, and I foul hooked the pike. And I had chub to £5 as well. So it's a good method. It definitely works. Apart from catching a couple of bream last winter down on the tidal Stour, which is an interesting proposition because of course the flow varies down there with the tides. It can run hard, it can back up and hold, needs plenty of colour to work down there for the bigger fish to show. Also fished it around Wimborne and caught roach over £1. One or two swims that were pretty much impossible to float fish from where I was fishing anyway. Great big deep holes, and there's certainly some good roach down there. So it's a method that when the conditions are right, need maybe another couple of months, I'll give it a go down there. And away you go. Give each swim up to an hour. If you're still catching after an hour, stick with it. If you haven't had a bite, or you've had maybe a roach or two fairly quickly and then nothing, it's probably best to move down river. Some of the stretches at Oxford that I did well on were Medley, the Channel, which is just below Medley, and Donington. Peter Stone used to fish at what they call Folly, which is upstream from Folly Bridge. There was one or two noted spots there. One of his lifetime ambitions was to catch a £2 roach from the Thames. He caught £2 roach from a couple of the tributaries, the Avon and the Windrush, I believe, but never got one out the Thames. He got pretty close. I don't know whether they got to 115, but certainly up that way. And Andy Nellist has actually had £2 roach at Oxford, and he's not the only one. There's some huge fish in there, just as there are in my local Stour and local Avon. So there's a method. It is easy to use. You need confidence in it. If you're going to use this method, don't take 2 pints of maggots and, oh, I'll give it a go for half an hour, or try and sit in one swim all day. Doesn't work. You've got to rove, get off your backside and move. So ideal stretches where there's more than one swim are probably best. And try different swims, and you may find that swims you've normally fished with a float will produce fish, because this method will let you fish in a way that you can't do with a float. I've looked at the Thames and thought, well, maybe I could fish the way I do at Wimborne with big floats down the middle and breadflake and ground bait. I'm not totally convinced it would work on the Thames, and some of the Stour swims where I've used it, very difficult to float fish, like I say. So it will get you into the areas that would be difficult to float fish, even with big floats. It's also quite useful, especially on the Thames, where you get places like the Channel, which is quite narrow, and that pushes hard. It's quite deep in places, but you can get tight under the far bank, which is of course where the chub are, but there's often big roach with the chub. It's also the place where the snags are, so you're more likely to hook snags as well once you get tight to the far bank bushes and you've got a feeder that's moving. I hope I've got you thinking. Give it a try. Don't be afraid to fish with it. Leave the keep net at home. You're going to be roving. You don't want a keep net. It's just going to hinder you, make you less likely to move. Like I say, give it a try. Let me know how you get on. That's it for this episode, and see you again soon.